Well, do you consider yourself a trusting person? Do you trust people? Well, generally speaking, we tend to guard our trust and we tend to withhold trust. And when we look at the condition that the world is in today, well, it is no wonder that we feel that way. When we look at the political institutions, the social institutions, the economic institutions, and even unfortunately at times, the family institution, well, we may rightly ask, well, who can we trust? And because of that, we find ourselves putting limits on our trust. We may trust someone this much, but not this much. Or we may trust someone with this, but not with this over here. And isn't it true that we usually base our trust, especially when it comes to trusting a person, on our knowledge of them and our experiences with them? Now, here's a question that pertains to our discussion today. Do you trust God? And if so, how much? Do you trust him completely, totally? Do you trust him with your very life? Do you trust him when he says that he will care for you and your family's needs, even during a global pandemic? Well, why is it so important that we have complete and total trust in Jehovah God today? Well, it's because of what we find here at Matthew. Matthew chapter 24, and notice verse 21. It says, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the world's beginning until now, no, nor will occur again." A great tribulation. Now, we've seen problems, we've seen woe on this earth. We've seen the devastating effects of war, the catastrophic results of natural disasters. But this great tribulation will be something that we've never seen on the earth before. Now, we know that this tribulation will culminate into Armageddon. And that tribulation will be so great that we will begin to doubt Jehovah's ability to save us. It will test our trust in Jehovah's saving power. So now is the time for us to build within ourselves qualities that will draw us into a close relationship with Jehovah, and qualities that will enable us to demonstrate our trust in him. Now, in order to do that, we're going to consider 3 examples of when Jehovah demonstrated his saving power in the past. We're going to see what he did for Noah, the Apostle Peter, and in the days of King Hezekiah. And with these 3 examples, we're going to build our knowledge of Jehovah and our experience with him through the examples of his saving power in the past. So let's consider our first example, what Jehovah did for Noah. Now, the scriptures tell us that the days of Noah were filled with violence. Notice how that is described here in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 6, and we're going to read 2 verses, verse 5 and verse 11. Genesis 6:5, it says, "Consequently, Jehovah saw that man's wickedness was great on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only bad all the time." In verse 11, "But the earth had become ruined in the sight of the true God, and the earth was filled with violence." Now, we know that violent acts had occurred on the earth prior to Noah's day, because we remember that Cain murdered his brother Abel. But evidently, violence had reached an unprecedented scale. Now, we know why. It was because demons materialized human bodies in order to come to the earth to have sex with women. Now, as a result of this unnatural union between these demons and women, it produced a superhuman offspring of giants in the earth. Now, what is interesting is how Greek legends and Greek mythology, how that describes superhuman demigods that came to the earth and perpetrated great acts of violence and sexual depravity upon mankind, and how that actually ties in with what the Bible says about the demons and their giant offspring. In fact, the scriptures liken that time to the perversions of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, we can only imagine how difficult it must have been for Noah to try to raise his family in the truth in that violent, sex-mad world. No doubt Noah longed for relief. No doubt he felt trapped in that environment. Well, Noah had to rely on Jehovah and his power to save him and his family. And Noah's trust was rewarded. Let's read what happened. We're going to read two scriptures. We're going to stay in the book of Genesis, chapter 6, but we're going to read verse 17, and then we're going to jump over and read Genesis chapter 7 and verse 23. So first, Genesis 6:17, and here Jehovah is speaking. And he says, "As for me, I am going to bring flood waters upon the earth to destroy from under the heavens all flesh that has the breath of life. Everything on the earth will perish." Now let's jump over to chapter 7 and verse 23. "So he, Jehovah, wiped every living thing from the surface of the earth, including man, animals, creeping animals, and the flying creatures of the sky. They were all wiped off the earth. Only Noah and those with him in the ark survived." Here, Jehovah simply made it rain and saved Noah and his family. Well, what do we learn from this first example? Well, when we look at Noah and his environment, then we could ask, what helped Noah to avoid being corrupted by the world around him? One word: righteousness. And in this context, righteousness means conforming to God's standards and his commands, not those of the world around us. Now, how do people usually act when they are in a bad, wicked environment? Well, they usually act just like everyone around them. And they may say that. They may say, I am a product of my environment. Have you ever heard anybody say that? They may say, well, you know why I think the way I think and do the things I do? Well, look at what's around me. I'm a product of my environment. Well, what helped Noah to avoid becoming a product of his environment? Well, Noah never adopted the thinking, the standards, or the attitudes of the wicked world around him. Now, what about us? What kind of environment are we in? Violent, sex-mad, just like Noah? Well, what will prevent us from becoming products of our environment? What's the same thing that helped Noah? Righteousness, conforming to God's standards and his commands, not that of this wicked world around us. Now we know it's very difficult to avoid having the world rub off on us. And so we need to ask ourselves, has the thinking, the attitude, or the standards of this world begun to affect our view of material things, dressing, grooming, or our entertainment? Now there's another lesson that we learn from this example of Noah. We don't know whether that was the first time it had ever rained on the earth or not. But what we do know is it was the first time it ever rained like that. Well, what does that teach us? Well, that teaches us that Jehovah could use the natural forces of this earth in a way that he's previously never done before in order to save his people. So yes, Jehovah can deliver us from a wicked environment. Well, let's go to our second example, and that is the Apostle Peter. In 44 CE, Peter was put in prison by Herod Agrippa, who was the ruler of Palestine at the time, and he intended to have Peter killed. Now, that was no veiled threat, because earlier this Herod had executed James, the brother of John, and evidently he planned to do the same with Peter. Now, we know the account. It shows us that while Peter was in his prison cell, he was guarded by 4 shifts of 4 soldiers each. Now, evidently, what that meant was while Peter was in his cell, he was chained to a guard on his right, chained to a guard on his left, and then outside of the prison cell stood 2 other guards. 4 guards, 4 shifts each. Now, talk about being in a maximum security prison. Now, you would think that it would be impossible for Peter to get out of something like that. However, we know nothing is impossible for Jehovah. Let's read the account together. We find it in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 12, and we're going to read 3 verses, verse 7, and then 10 and 11. So Acts 12:7 says, "But look, Jehovah's angel was standing there, and a light shone in the prison cell. Hitting Peter on the side, he woke him, saying, 'Get up quickly.' And the chains fell off his hands." Verses 10 and 11. "Going past the first centennial guard and the second, they reached the iron gate leading into the city, and this opened to them by itself. After they went out, they made their way down one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. And Peter, realizing what was happening, said, 'Now I know for sure that Jehovah sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's hand and from everything that the Jews were expecting to happen.' Jehovah here sent an angel and delivered Peter." Now, while we cannot expect such divine intervention in all of our personal circumstances, this example shows us what Jehovah can do and will do for us according to his will. Now, what do we learn from this example? Well, perhaps you feel like Peter. Perhaps you feel like you are chained to a set of impossible circumstances. And maybe you feel because of your impossible circumstances, you could never fully live up to your dedication to Jehovah. Or maybe you feel because of your difficult circumstances that you could never dedicate yourself to Jehovah and get baptized. Or maybe you feel because of these impossible circumstances that you have, that you could never make progress in the truth, perhaps into the full-time ministry, or maybe come to Bethel. Well, what does this example of Peter teach us? That no matter how challenging, no matter how difficult, or how impossible our circumstances may seem, Jehovah can always make the way out for us to serve him. Let's go to our 3rd example, and that is what Jehovah did in the days of King Hezekiah. Now, during Hezekiah's reign, Assyria, which was the 2nd world power at the time, came against Judah for war. Now, that was a serious situation. You see, because the Assyrians were known for their cruelty and how they would sadistically torture their captives. In fact, one conquering warrior, he bragged about what he did to one city that he conquered, and this is what he said. He said, "From some, I cut off their hands and their fingers, and from others, I cut off their noses, their ears. Of many, I put the eyes out." And he goes on to say things that we just won't mention. So when the Assyrians came against you for war, that was serious. Well, how do you think Hezekiah felt? Fearful? Absolutely. No doubt Hezekiah was gripped with fear. But what did he do? Hezekiah trusted in Jehovah, and he leaned on the power of prayer. Let's read Hezekiah's prayer together. We find it in the book of 2 Kings. 2 Kings chapter 19, and we're going to read verse 19. And notice Hezekiah's prayer to Jehovah. He says, "But now, O Jehovah our God, please save us out of his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are God, O Jehovah." Well, Jehovah heard Hezekiah's heartfelt prayer of trust and reliance on him. And Jehovah answered Hezekiah's prayer in a miraculous way. Let's read what happened. We find it in verse 35. It says, on that very night, the angel of Jehovah went out and struck down 185,000 men in the camp of the Assyrians. When people rose up early in the morning, they saw all the dead bodies. Jehovah sent one angel and eliminated the Assyrian threat. Well, what are some things we learn from this example? Well, what happens to a person when they are in a fearful situation or they become gripped with fear? Well, usually they panic, or they make an unwise decision, or they do something unwise. Now, that's what Hezekiah could have done. Hezekiah could have become fearful, and he could have leaned on the pagan nations around him for help. Besides, that's what other Judean kings had done. That's what his own father did. Hezekiah could have thought to himself, I'll go down to Egypt. They have a large military force. They have many horses. They have those chariots with the knives on the wheels. I'll ask them to help me. Well, that would have been a big mistake, because that would have incurred Jehovah's disfavor. Well, now, what about you? What are some situations that could make you become fearful or gripped with fear, and because of that make you make an unwise decision or do something not wise? Perhaps you are a young person in school and you fear being ridiculed by your classmates. And because of that fear, you may do something unwise. Perhaps start using profanity, or maybe try smoking, or using drugs, or becoming involved with a member of the opposite sex. Or maybe you are a single person in Jehovah's organization and you fear that you will never find a suitable mate. And because of that fear, you may do something unwise, like becoming romantically involved with an unbeliever. Or maybe you are facing a life-threatening medical situation and the blood issue has come up. You see, whatever situation we may find ourselves in that could make us fearful or become gripped with fear, what does this example of Hezekiah teach us? Trust in Jehovah. Rely on him and on the power of prayer. Now, there's something else we learned from this example, and that is Jehovah certainly fights for his people. And with Jehovah on our side, we are always the majority. Now, we know that Jehovah has millions and millions of angels in his heavenly army, myriads times myriads. Now, if one angel could take care of 185,000, and Jehovah has hundreds of millions of angels in his army, well, what does that add up to? 185,000 times 100 million? Well, we could do the math on that. With Jehovah on our side, we are always the majority. Armageddon need not last long. Jehovah will certainly use his angelic forces to fight for his people. Well, those three examples that we've just considered, they certainly build our trust and our confidence in Jehovah and his saving power. But Jehovah's greatest expression of saving power was not one of those three examples that we've considered. Jehovah's greatest expression of saving power was giving us his son, Jesus Christ. In giving us Jesus, it was Jehovah's greatest expression of love, but it was also his greatest expression of saving power. Now, how can we say that? Well, ever since our forefather, Adam, sold us into sin and death, notice the condition that every human on the planet finds himself in. We find it in the book of Romans. Romans chapter 5, and verse 12. And notice what that says. Romans 5:12. That is why, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin. And so death spread to all men because they had all sinned. So because of inherited sin and imperfection from our forefather Adam, we are doomed to death. But the shed blood of Jesus Christ is so precious to us because it opens up the opportunity for us to have everlasting life. Now, we said in giving us his son, it was Jehovah's greatest expression of love. Well, what can we make of that statement? Well, it's because of what we find here in a very familiar text, John chapter 3 and verse 16. Let's read it together and examine it a little bit. John 3:16, it says, "For God loved the world so much that he gave his only begotten Son, so that everyone exercising faith in him might not be destroyed, but have everlasting life." Now, that term, only begotten, it means that Jesus Christ was the only creature in the universe directly created by Jehovah God himself. Now, we try to imagine the closeness and the depth of the relationship that Jehovah God and Jesus had. Now, in order to do that, we usually liken it to the relationship of a father with an only son that he has that he dearly loves. But that comparison doesn't really scratch the surface of the depth of relationship that Jehovah God and Jesus Christ must have had. You see, that Greek word, only begotten, it carries the sense of unique, unparalleled, and incomparable, meaning that we could never think of a more tender, confidential, close, loving relationship than the one that existed between Jehovah God and Jesus Christ, because there was simply nothing like it. Now, if Jehovah was willing to give us something so precious and so dear and valuable to himself, then that means he must really love us, and he must really want to save us. Well, how do we benefit from this greatest expression of Jehovah's saving power? Well, there's something that we must do, and we find that in verse 36. John 3:36. Notice what it says we need to do. It says, "The one who exercises faith in the Son has everlasting life. The one who disobeys the Son will not see life, but the wrath of God remains upon him." So there it is. That's what we must do. We must exercise faith. Well, what does that mean? Well, if I fail to exercise this muscle, you know what would happen to it? It would atrophy. There's a medical term, meaning the muscle and the body tissue would literally wilt away because of lack of use. Your faith is the same. Without exercising our faith, without demonstrating it, or without giving expression to our faith, then it will literally wilt away and die. So in order for us to benefit from Jehovah's greatest expression of saving power, we must exercise faith in Jesus Christ. Well, how do we recognize Jehovah's saving power in our life today? Well, we do that through the evidence of the power of prayer. Well, what is prayer? Prayer is actual communication with Jehovah God, where we come into his presence and he actually hears us. Prayer is a miracle within itself, and we could never overemphasize the importance of tapping into Jehovah's saving power through prayer. Well, how did Jehovah answer our prayers today? Well, today, Jehovah need not answer our prayers in some miraculous way, like those three examples that we considered. But today, Jehovah gives us his spirit, and his spirit gives us the power to cope with our problems. It gives us more strength, more enlightenment, and direction needed to make wise decisions. So today, the answers to our prayers are mainly spiritual. However, they are just as vital and just as important, because Jehovah's Spirit is the most powerful force in the universe. And when Jehovah gives us that Spirit, then there is nothing that we cannot accomplish. Now, why is it so important for us to believe that and understand that today? Well, it's because we are suffering. We're going through many problems and difficulties and challenges. We're experiencing this global pandemic. We are experiencing natural disasters. We have want, we have need, we have difficulties. And Jehovah knows that we have these things, and that is when we need him the most. Because what happens when we're going through these difficulties? How do we sometimes feel about ourselves? Well, notice what we find here in the book of Psalm 34, and we're going to read verses 18 and 19. And notice this description and see how we feel this way at times. Psalm 34:18 says, Jehovah is close to the brokenhearted. He saves those who are crushed in spirit. Many are the hardships of the righteous one, but Jehovah rescues him from them all. And isn't that sometimes how we feel about ourselves? Brokenhearted, crushed in spirit, having many hardships. Well, what is the tendency of a person who's experiencing difficulties like that? Well, usually we tend to withdraw. Right? We withdraw from people. We withdraw into ourselves. We may stop going to meetings, engaging in a ministry, personal study. We may even stop praying to Jehovah God himself. Well, Jehovah knows that when we are experiencing problems like that, we need him the most. And that's when he is most ever ready to help us. So when we are experiencing suffering and we're having problems and difficulties, never should we feel that it is because Jehovah has somehow withdrawn his spirit from us. Jehovah has withdrawn his saving power from us, and that's why we're having these problems. Because sometimes that's how we think, don't we? But nothing could be further from the truth. Now, why do we say that? Well, because of the assurance that we find here in the book of Psalm again, but this time we're going to read chapter 94, Psalm 94, and notice verse 14 and the assurance that Jehovah gives us. It says, for Jehovah will not forsake his people, nor will he abandon his inheritance. So when we are experiencing problems and we're having difficulties, it is not because Jehovah has withdrawn his saving power from us, because nothing could be further from the truth. Jehovah assures us that he would never forsake his people. He will never abandon us. The reason why we're having problems, the reason why we're suffering, is because we're living the last days of Satan's system. Satan's system is the problem. And we can have total confidence and trust that Jehovah will give us his spirit through the power of prayer, because prayer is an avenue of tapping in to Jehovah's saving power. Well, very soon now, Jehovah will demonstrate his saving power in one final way. Jehovah will bring Armageddon on this earth. Now, when that happens, there are going to be many casualties, but there will also be many survivors. The question is, will you be a casualty or will you be a survivor? Well, we want to be survivors. We want to survive the end of this wicked system of things. And we can do that by keeping close in mind the presence of the day of Jehovah, being thoroughly involved in our spiritual activities, meeting attendance, personal study, the ministry. In effect, living up to our dedication to Jehovah. So let us reflect on Jehovah's saving acts in the past. They will build our trust and our confidence in Jehovah, knowing that Jehovah will do the same for us. Very soon now, Jehovah is going to bring an end to Satan and his wicked system. And when he does, may all of us experience Jehovah's saving power.